I'm going to start with some spiritual aspects of starting a new venture. And the first of those really is we need to ask ourselves the question, why do I want to start a new venture? That might seem a little bit obvious at first, but I think it's extremely important for us to be really sure why it is that we want to start a new organization, why we want to start a new venture. And I would say to you that as Christians, if we're starting any venture, whether it be a business venture or whether it be a venture, Christian mission, any organization, we need to ask ourselves this question: why am I doing it? Am I doing it actually because I want to advance my career, or I think it's a good thing to do? Are we doing it actually because we want to build ourselves up? We call it self-aggrandizement, if you like. We want to be seen as somebody who's doing something, who's done something, who's leading something. What I would say is that we need to be really sure, if we're going to start a new venture, that we're starting it because God is calling us to do that venture. That is very important, not in just starting the venture, but in maintaining us when we find there are difficulties. And you might not like to hear me say this, but I speak now from many years' experience. Organizations do not just go like that. And excited though you may be about some new enterprise or some new venture, some new evangelistic activity or mission that you want to engage in, yes, God is with us in that, but God often tests us too. And we need to remember as believers that we live in a fallen world. So that means that not everything, even if it's God's work that we're engaged in, is just going to go smoothly with no problems at all. So our sense of calling, I have found, is absolutely vital at times like that. I'm involved in a mission I'll refer to a few times this afternoon called Africa Rural Trainers. We train rural pastors in Kenya. We train them in the Bible over 3 years, and we also help them with farming. We have known since 2008, 2009, when we started that work, a number of significant setbacks and pressures, sometimes to the point of saying, why are we here? What are we doing this for? It's too difficult, it's too painful. And every time I come back to, why am I here? Because God has called me here. I can do no other than be here because God has called me. When that sense of calling goes, then it's time to think about, well, do I retire? Do I move on to something else? So a sense of calling, I think, is absolutely vital for us. We need also to avoid this sacred-secular divide, that somehow it's only Christians in full-time Christian service who have a calling into that ministry. Even if you're thinking about a business venture, is God laying that on your heart? Is that something that He wants you to do? Because whether we're in what we call full-time Christian service, I hate that expression, or whether we're in business, actually we're all in full-time Christian mission. If you're in business, your mission field is your co-workers, your clients, your shareholders, whoever you might have around you, and that is your mission field. We need to be sure about our calling to do that. Okay, so being certain about our calling, I would say, is a very key starting issue for us. I think another question that we can only deal with briefly this afternoon is to ask ourselves the question: you may have a bright idea, a wonderful idea, but are you the right person to start that venture, that organization, and to lead it going forward? Some of the questions that we need to ask ourselves are we a leader or are we a manager? Managers are people who manage people, processes, things, and they can be very good at doing that. But they're not always leaders. Leaders, on the other hand, are people who are able to inspire, able to motivate. There are people who come up with ideas. And they're people who have a big picture. And putting it simply, they're people whom others will follow. So in making that distinction, managers may not be leaders, but I would suggest to you again from my experience that all leaders need also to be managers. Now, we may not be perfect managers, but a lot of the activity of management surrounds skills that we can learn. And so if you are a leader and you're starting out on a new venture, you need to be thinking about what skills can I acquire that will help me to be a better leader. But you cannot necessarily be just made into a leader by going on some MBA course. There are certain traits and characteristics of us as individuals that dispose us towards leadership versus maybe management. So you may be an inspirational leader, but actually lacking in understanding accounting or what the numbers mean. You may not be so good at team management, but there are things that we can do to learn about that process as leaders. So that's a little bit of background to some of the things that we need to think about spiritually, about ourselves. Are we the right person? What are our characteristics? Let's move on now to think a little bit about some of the practical foundations that we need to lay in starting a new venture. This diagram that you have on the screen shows you 5 steps that are involved in setting up a new venture. I have not got time today to cover all of those, or even some of them in any great depth. This is a slide from a much longer course which I teach. But what I want to do is to just focus on one or two of these aspects. Firstly, the ideas generation stage, what I've called the conception of the new venture, the new organisation, and also focus a bit on developing a plan. That's the planning phase. And then say just a few words on the execution, the last stage, executing the plan. So let's begin by thinking about the ideas creation, the first step in setting up a new venture. Why would you want to set up a new venture? Well, if you're here and you're thinking about setting up a new venture, it usually means that you've got some ideas. You spotted an opportunity. And one of the things that often distinguishes leaders from entrepreneurial leaders is the entrepreneur is always looking around and absorbing the world around them, and is one who is spotting opportunities, seeing problems and thinking out solutions. If you're that sort of person, that's how you tick, then you are probably an entrepreneur or an entrepreneurial leader. But it's not sufficient just to have an idea. We need to be able to think through that idea and to articulate it in terms of a vision. Now, some Christians have problems with the notion of a vision and think, well, that's very much a business thing, isn't it? We don't have visions in the church. A vision really is no more than having an idea that expresses itself in something out on the horizon that you want to try to achieve. It might be reaching the millennium generation. That's a huge goal. That might be your passion and your vision. And a vision usually needs to be something which is fairly far-reaching. And then the whole point of having a vision is that it gives you something that you're aiming at. If you've just got some vague feelings about some area of ministry, but you don't really know what it is that you want to be able to do, then I would suggest that that idea needs an awful lot more development, to the point where you can articulate it in a very simple few words. So how do we develop that idea? What we basically need to do is to iterate around on the idea and to refine it, to research it a little bit more. And one of the things that we need to do in that process is what I call due diligence, that is doing the research. Too many people come up with a great idea that is really, might be as big as reaching the millennium generation, but it's not thought through in terms of what do we actually mean by that? What does that look like? What am I going to do tomorrow about achieving that vision, that idea that I've actually got? And some of the things that we need to do, well, actually all of the things we need to do in the due diligence process is to ask questions. Due diligence is about questions, questions, questions. And I just put a few down here, why, who, how sort of questions. Why is the venture needed? You might think it's needed, but what do others think? You may have spotted a gap in ministry in your country or somewhere else. Why do you think that idea, that venture is actually needed? Do others agree with you? And when you've opened it up, do they say, yeah, I can see, yeah, I agree with that. So that is actually confirming that your idea is a good idea. We need to ask ourselves the question, who else is doing it? Is there somebody else actually already working in that space? That might mean that the venture isn't needed, or that you need to partner with that other person or organization, or maybe what they're doing is not actually quite aligned with what it is that you have in mind. Defining who it is that we're reaching, the demographics, the people. Do we understand actually enough about the people group that we may be trying to reach in our ministry? What are their characteristics? We, in Africa Rural Trainers, are reaching rural pastors. These are people who already are pastors. Understanding their context is extremely vital. For example, they're poor. They usually have 4 to 5 kids. They have a small plot of land, and they need to maintain that land in order to survive. Their church can't support them financially. All of the presuppositions that we might have as Europeans will just fall apart when you actually go and do the due diligence and understand the context in which you want to do, for example, Bible training of pastors in rural Africa. All of those things need to be understood to shape the vision. Just very quickly, there are other ways of thinking about new ideas and innovation in ministry. 3 pillars of innovation, I call them. That's the desirability, feasibility, and viability. But developing the idea and the vision is, I would suggest to you, a creative process. It's not a one-off process. It's something that we need to refine over time. And actually, this is something that even when you started an organization, we need to get into doing. So let me just show you very briefly what a vision statement might look like. This is Africa Rural Trainers' vision statement. Our vision is to impact African nations from within by equipping rural pastors and their wives with accurate knowledge of the Bible, an understanding of how to interpret it, and practical life skills. Supplementary to that, which is important to the way we see training, is crucial to our program, is mentoring and character development. Why? Because we're training, we're developing people who already are leaders in their community. So that's what a vision might look like. That's an example from the work that we're involved in. The next thing that we have to do is step 2. I'm going to move over this quite rapidly, is develop the strategic plan. So it's one thing to have an idea, but unless you know the steps to get you from where you are now to that idea will never happen. You'll never reach your goals. So the strategic plan is something that usually starts at a fairly long reach. We've just done a new strategic plan for Africa rural trainers, and it's called Vision 2030. That's a 15-year strategic plan. And once you've sort of set some pegs in the ground as to what it is that you want to try to achieve, for example, which countries you want to be working in, you then need to move to a much, much smaller scale, and that is the 1-year operational plan. The 1-year operational plan now says, okay, how do we get to the goals of our first year of this 15-year strategic plan? And that 1-year operational plan will work down to the level of you being able to say, okay, so what am I going to do tomorrow? What am I going to do next month? So that's the strategic plan. Just to wrap up with the last phase of that 5-step process, once we've got our venture off the ground, execution is extremely important, and many ventures can fail because of poor execution. And we need to get involved in a regular evaluation process of the organization and how it's going, how we're measuring up against our strategic plan. A strategic plan is not something that is cast in concrete. We need to learn from experience. We need to modify that plan in the light of experience. And we do that through the planning, the doing, and the checking, and the acting on those checks cycle, as I've shown in this diagram. So that's the whole process of execution. What might that look like? Let me end up here in this talk by just showing you what that process looked like in Africa Rural Trainers. We basically have been evaluating as we've gone along. We have a 3-year cycle pretty much for training pastors. And the 2 objectives that we started out with is teaching rural pastors the Bible to transform their lives from a position of being only having rudimentary knowledge of the Bible to really understanding how to handle God's Word. That was one main goal. The second was to lift them economically by helping them to improve their farming. Well, what we found was that incredible progress in terms of transformation. I've listed 6 major areas of transformation that we found in the lives of the pastors. If you're interested, go to our website. There's some videos, documentary on there, which I find very inspiring. But the sustainability side of what we wanted to do, we haven't yet achieved. In fact, we've had some major disasters. We lost about $150,000 in a 40-acre farm that got destroyed by a hailstone. We had the crops insured, so few insurance company refused to pay up. So these are the times when you think, God, what are you doing? What's all this about? And shall we just give up? No, God has called us to do this work. And then we think, well, what has God been doing? He's actually been transforming the lives of these pastors spiritually. So what do we do about the areas of failure? Well, we're working on another model of how we help and equip these rural pastors.